Florence is remembered as the jewel of the Renaissance, a city of beauty, power, and brilliance. When we hear its name, one family dominates the story: the Medici. They are remembered as bankers, patrons, and political masterminds who seem to shape the destiny of the entire city. But what if the story of Florence is larger than the Medici? What if behind the familiar tale lies a web of forgotten rivals whose ambition, wealth, and defiance shaped the city just as much? Their names, Albizzi, Strozzi, Pitti, and Pazzi, do not always command the same recognition today, but their struggles and rivalries left deep marks on Florence's history. These families were not just bystanders. They funded cathedrals, built palaces, supported artists, and fought to preserve republican ideals in a city constantly torn between liberty and tyranny. At times, they came dangerously close to altering history, as when the Pazzi nearly ended Medici rule in a single stroke during High Mass in the cathedral. Their defeats were often swift and brutal, but even in failure, they forced the Medici to adapt, leaving Florence shaped by a constant tug of war for power. To reduce Florence's story to a single dynasty is to miss its true richness. The rise and fall of rival families are essential chapters in understanding why Florence became what it was: a city alive with competition, creativity, and conflict. In this video, we uncover the forgotten challengers, their bold ambitions, their dramatic downfalls, and the legacy they left behind. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, and in this video, we will explore the untold stories of Florence beyond the Medici shadow, diving into the struggles, ambitions, and enduring impact of the rival families who shaped the destiny of the Renaissance city. The story of Florence is often told as though it belonged almost entirely to the Medici family, as if their rise and survival alone explain the city's extraordinary history. When people think of Florence in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, they tend to imagine the city as an invention of the Medici, with Cosimo the Elder and Lorenzo the Magnificent casting shadows across the Arno that no one else could rival. Yet Florence was far more than a backdrop for the Medici dynasty. It was a republic in which the push and pull of competing factions, guilds, and personalities shaped a political landscape that the Medici could never fully control. To focus too narrowly on the Medici is to miss what was truly at stake in Florence, and to forget the other forces and figures whose ambitions and struggles kept the city alive with possibility. In doing so, history loses much of what made Florence unique, because it was never a one-family story. When the Medici first emerged as a powerful force, they did so through banking wealth, patronage, and careful maneuvering, not through sheer domination. Cosimo de' Medici, often remembered as the founder of the family's political fortune, did not rule Florence outright. Instead, he worked through alliances, influence, and an uncanny ability to read the city's mood. This approach has often been described as a form of hidden monarchy, yet it was not absolute. Opponents regularly tried to dislodge him, and at times they succeeded. His exile early in his career showed how fragile power in Florence could be, even for someone with immense wealth. That fragility never fully went away. The structure of Florence itself prevented any single family from exercising unchecked control. The city was formerly a republic, governed by councils and offices filled by lot or election. While wealthy families bent the system, the forms of republicanism mattered. To present Florence as a Medici possession erases the constant negotiations with guilds, merchants, and rival clans that the family could not ignore. The Medici had influence, but that influence had to be reinforced by persuasion, gifts, and cultural display. They could not command obedience the way monarchs in other parts of Europe could. To treat them as absolute rulers distorts the reality that their hold on Florence was always precarious. Part of the reason the Medici overshadow the rest of Florentine history is the dazzling legacy of their patronage. Art, architecture, and letters flourished under their sponsorship. The works of Brunelleschi, Michelangelo, and countless others became tied to Medici names. Over time, this created an illusion that culture and family power were inseparable, as if the entire flowering of Florence was their gift alone. But artistic genius thrived in Florence before and beyond the Medici. Patronage came from many directions: guilds funding chapels, merchants commissioning altarpieces, confraternities sponsoring processions, and rival families competing for status. The focus on the Medici narrows the lens so much that we forget how broad the base of cultural support truly was. Behind the Medici story were challengers whose contributions were just as decisive. The Albizzi family, for example, once held the kind of sway in Florence that later became associated with the Medici. Their dominance in the early 15th century was built on long experience in city politics and strong ties to the ruling elite. Cosimo's rise came partly from displacing the Albizzi, and his victory was neither quick nor certain. Remembering them reminds us that Florence was always a contested space. For every Medici triumph, there were opponents who believed the Republic should remain free from dynastic rule. Other families, such as the Strozzi, played similar roles as counterweights. They amassed wealth through trade and banking, rivaling the Medici on financial terms. Their opposition made Florence unstable and dynamic, ensuring that the city's story was never only about the consolidation of one family's influence. When the Medici were exiled in the late 15th century, it was the Strozzi and their allies who helped shape Florence's experiment in republican renewal. These moments of challenge and reversal matter deeply, yet they tend to fade when the Medici are presented as inevitable masters of Florence. There were also moments when outside forces reshaped Florence in ways that the Medici could not control. The arrival of King Charles of France in the late 15th century, for example, forced the expulsion of the Medici and opened the door to the radical preaching of Savonarola. For a brief time, Florence lived under a vision of moral reform that clashed directly with Medici culture. That interlude, remembered for its bonfire of vanities and sharp turn toward religious intensity, shows how quickly the family's grip could be broken. It also shows that Florence contained currents of thought and aspiration that had nothing to do with Medici ambition. The belief that the Medici always prevailed is a distortion created by hindsight. Because the family ultimately returned to power and maintained a ducal state, it is easy to look backward and imagine their dominance as unbroken. But in reality, their story was marked by vulnerability and periods of absence. The Republic continued to function without them, producing ideas about citizenship, freedom, and governance that influenced political thought far beyond Tuscany. To lose sight of this is to lose sight of Florence as a laboratory of Republican ideals, where debates about liberty and tyranny carried real weight. One of the greatest costs of reducing Florence to the Medici shadow is that we forget the city's intellectual ferment. Thinkers such as Coluccio Salutati, Leonardo Bruni, and Marsilio Ficino helped to define humanism in ways that were not dependent on Medici sponsorship. Their engagement with classical texts, their attempts to reconcile civic duty with individual flourishing, and their vision of education as the foundation of a healthy republic were products of a broader culture of learning. The Medici supported some of these efforts, but they did not create them from nothing. Florence's intellectual energy was already alive, sustained by its schools, libraries, and circles of scholars. Florence also lost something when later generations remembered only the grandeur of Medici patronage. The struggles of guilds, the sacrifices of exiled families, and the ideals of those who resisted dynastic power became less visible. The story became one of inevitability, as if Florence was destined to become a Medici state. What disappears in that telling is the memory of citizens who believed in republican freedom and worked to protect it, even when they failed. Those forgotten efforts show a Florence that was not only a stage for magnificent rulers, but also a city of restless people trying to shape their own destiny. By narrowing the story to Medici power, we also overlook the ways Florence's decline as a republic was felt as a real loss by contemporaries. For many Florentines, the shift toward ducal rule was not a natural evolution, but a betrayal of civic ideals. It meant the end of a political tradition that had allowed citizens to imagine themselves as participants in government rather than subjects of a dynasty. The Medici shadow hides this grief and the sense of something irreplaceable slipping away. To remember only their splendor is to forget the price that was paid in liberty. The Medici were skilled at shaping memory. They invested in histories, commissioned portraits, and promoted narratives that elevated their role. This self-fashioning helped ensure that later generations would see them as the central actors in Florence's drama. Yet those narratives were constructed, not inevitable. They succeeded in part because the brilliance of the art they sponsored dazzled the imagination, making it difficult to separate beauty from power. Over time, the illusion hardened into a story of absolute control. Breaking that illusion requires looking again at what was pushed aside. Florence lost not only rival families and republican ideals, but also a more nuanced understanding of how power truly worked in the city. Instead of imagining politics as the triumph of one house, we might see it as a constant negotiation among many forces. Merchants balancing profit and duty, guilds defending privileges, exiles plotting returns, and ordinary citizens participating in processions, votes, and public rituals. That world was vibrant, unstable, and alive with tension. It was a world where the Medici were important, but never the whole. To recover this forgotten Florence is to see more clearly what made it so remarkable. The Medici shadow is long, but behind it lies a city where freedom was debated, where art came from many sources, and where power was always contested. Remembering this Florence allows us to appreciate not only the triumphs of one family, but also the richness of a community that refused, again and again, to be reduced to a single story. It is in that wider memory that we find what was truly lost when the Medici became the sole heirs of Florentine fame. The Strozzi family is a crucial part of the story of Florence, yet they too have often been relegated to the margins of memory because of the overwhelming presence of the Medici in historical narratives. When the Strozzi are mentioned at all, it is usually as footnotes in the Medici saga, described as rivals who could not quite measure up. But if we step back from the Medici-centered vision, the Strozzi emerge as one of the most fascinating families in Florence, representing a different path to power, one rooted in immense wealth, broad networks, and a determination to preserve the city's republican character against creeping dynastic control. Their story reveals what Florence might have been had the Republic not been bent more and more toward the will of one family. By looking at the Strozzi, we can see more clearly the alternative models of power that were possible, and we gain a fuller sense of what was lost when Florence forgot these figures. The Strozzi were among the wealthiest families of Florence, their fortune built on banking and international trade. Like the Medici, they expanded outward, connecting Florence to the broader Mediterranean and beyond. Their banking network rivaled the Medici's in both reach and sophistication, and they were masters at cultivating ties with courts, merchants, and other cities. Wealth in Florence did not simply buy luxury. It bought influence, alliances, and the means to shape politics. The Strozzi understood this as well as the Medici did, and for a time, they stood as equals in the competition to define the direction of the Republic. What distinguished the Strozzi was not just the size of their fortune, but their willingness to use it as a shield against Medici encroachment. While the Medici invested heavily in cultural display to cloak their political maneuvers in a language of magnificence, the Strozzi used their wealth to assert independence and to remind Florence that the city was not yet the possession of a single dynasty. Their opposition was not only political but also symbolic, carried in the very stones of the structures they commissioned. This is where the figure of Filippo Strozzi the Elder becomes central. Filippo was a man of immense ambition and pride. His palace, the Palazzo Strozzi, remains one of the most striking statements of defiance in Renaissance Florence. Unlike the Medici palace, which had a restrained elegance suited to Cosimo's careful balancing act, the Strozzi palace was bold, expansive, and uncompromising in its grandeur. It was designed to proclaim that the Strozzi were equals, not subordinates. The size and expense of the project were staggering, and it is said that Filippo wanted his palace to surpass that of the Medici in every way. This act of architectural rivalry was about more than taste. It was a declaration of political independence, a reminder to Florence that no single family could claim unquestioned dominance. Filippo's attempts to outmaneuver Lorenzo the Magnificent extended beyond architecture. He used his wealth to forge alliances, support exiled opponents of the Medici, and cultivate influence abroad. His vision was of a Florence where multiple great families shared power, where the Republic maintained its traditions rather than bending entirely to dynastic control. Lorenzo, with his unmatched charisma and cultural brilliance, made it difficult to resist his charm, but Filippo stood firm as a symbol of resistance. Their rivalry was not merely personal, it reflected two visions of Florence. One vision was dynastic, where power was increasingly centralized in the Medici name. The other was pluralistic, where republican ideals and shared influence remained alive. The Medici had an uncanny ability to weave themselves into the very identity of Florence, but the Strozzi resisted being absorbed into that narrative. This resistance came at great cost. The Medici were relentless in using exile as a tool against rivals, and the Strozzi were no exception. Exile in Florence was not simply removal from the city. It was a form of erasure, an attempt to cut families off from the networks that sustained their power. For the Strozzi, exile was a repeated experience, yet it did not extinguish their determination. From abroad, they continued to plot, invest, and wait for moments when the Medici grip faltered. Exile revealed the persistence of Florentine Republican spirit. Many exiled families, including the Strozzi, saw themselves as guardians of liberty, unjustly expelled by a family that had overstepped the limits of legitimate influence. Their writings, alliances, and conspiracies kept alive the idea that Florence was not destined to be a Medici state. The Strozzi worked tirelessly to return, and at times they came close to success. But ultimately, their efforts were unsuccessful, and the Medici proved more adept at consolidating power over the long term. Still, the Strozzi story reminds us that Florence did not quietly submit. Resistance was constant, even if history has often forgotten it. The loss of the Strozzi legacy in collective memory is a telling example of how history gets shaped by victors. Because the Medici established themselves not only as rulers, but also as patrons of memory, funding histories, supporting chroniclers, and ensuring their name was attached to Florence's cultural triumphs. Their rivals were pushed into obscurity. The Palazzo Strozzi remains as physical evidence of what they stood for, but without the same machinery of memory, their role in shaping the city has been diminished in popular imagination. Yet if we look closely, their influence is undeniable. They provided a counterbalance, forcing the Medici to moderate their ambitions at times, and their defiance kept alive the sense that Florence's Republican identity had defenders. The persistence of the Strozzi, even in failure, speaks to the resilience of Florence as a city of contested visions. They remind us that the Medici were never unchallenged, that their rise was not inevitable, and that the city could have followed a different path. The fact that the Strozzi ultimately lost does not make their role any less significant. Instead, it underscores what was lost when Florence came to be seen only through Medici eyes. The city lost the memory of its pluralism, of the families and factions that made it a republic, of the fierce debates over liberty and tyranny that defined civic life. When we place the Strozzi back into the story, Florence appears less as the stage for a single dynasty and more as a living republic where power was always contested, where wealth could both empower and endanger, and where exile could never fully extinguish the hope of return. The shadow of the Medici may be long, but the Strozzi remind us that behind that shadow were families who refused to surrender, who believed that Florence could be more than the possession of one house. By remembering them, we recover a fuller, richer picture of the city, one that honors both its grandeur and its struggles. The story of Florence becomes even clearer when we shift our attention from the Strozzi to another of the city's ambitious families, the Pitti. Like the Strozzi, the Pitti sought to challenge the dominance of the Medici, and like the Strozzi, their challenge came not only through political maneuvering, but also through monumental architecture meant to declare their place in the city's hierarchy. The rivalry between these houses reveals the texture of Florentine politics, where architecture, wealth, and alliances intertwined with ambition and defiance. To understand how Florence truly functioned, we must bring the Pitti back into view, because their rise, their attempts at conspiracy, and their eventual decline illustrate both the possibilities and the dangers of standing in opposition to the Medici shadow. At the heart of the Pitti story stands Luca Pitti, whose name is inseparable from the palace that still bears his family's mark. The Palazzo Pitti, later expanded into one of the grandest residences of Florence, began as Luca's audacious answer to the Medici's architectural display. Where Cosimo de' Medici had chosen restraint in commissioning the Palazzo Medici Riccardi, balancing elegance with republican modesty, Luca Pitti embraced sheer scale as his weapon. The design of his palace was meant to overwhelm, to leave no doubt that the Pitti family could stand alongside or even above the Medici in grandeur. The facade was massive, its stones larger and rougher than those of the Medici palace, projecting strength, ambition, and independence. It was not just a home, but a manifesto in stone, a declaration that Florence would not be defined by the Medici alone. The architectural competition between the Medici and the Pitti underscores how power in Florence was communicated not only through councils and alliances, but also through the very buildings that shaped the city's streets. Each palace was a statement of values and identity. The Medici palace, with its careful proportions, spoke to Cosimo's preference for subtle control, influence exercised quietly and invisibly. Luca Pitti's palace, by contrast, shouted ambition, daring anyone to believe the Medici were the sole arbiters of magnificence. To build such a structure required not only wealth, but also confidence in the family's political standing. For a moment, it seemed as though the Pitti might indeed claim a place at the very center of Florentine life. Yet architecture alone could not secure power in Florence. Behind the palace walls, politics was a battlefield where fortunes could shift overnight. Luca Pitti's ambitions soon brought him into direct conflict with Piero de' Medici, the son of Cosimo. When Cosimo died, Piero inherited not only wealth, but also the delicate web of alliances that sustained Medici influence. Many believed Piero, less tested and less formidable than his father, might falter, creating an opening for rivals. The Pitti family, along with other dissatisfied factions, saw this as their chance to curb Medici dominance and reassert the pluralism of the Republic. The Pitti's maneuvering culminated in a conspiracy aimed at undermining Piero's leadership. This conspiracy, however, was poorly timed and poorly executed. Piero proved more resilient than his enemies expected, holding on to power and exposing the weaknesses of those who opposed him. For the Pitti, the failure was devastating. Florence was not forgiving to those who plotted unsuccessfully. The price of miscalculation was political ruin, and the family's fortunes began to unravel. What had once seemed like a promising rival force now appeared as another casualty of the Medici's ability to outmaneuver opposition. The decline of the Pitti family is a striking reminder of how fragile power was in Florence. Wealth and ambition could build a palace and assemble allies, but without the ability to navigate the city's constantly shifting alliances, even the strongest families could quickly fall into obscurity. The Medici, for all their vulnerabilities, possessed an extraordinary talent for recovering from setbacks and turning potential weaknesses into sources of strength. The Pitti lacked this gift. Their attempt to seize the moment after Cosimo's death revealed both their boldness and their limits. Once the conspiracy failed, they never fully recovered. Over time, the Pitti family's influence faded, and their once grand palace passed into the hands of their rivals. Ironically, the Medici themselves eventually purchased the Palazzo Pitti, transforming it into one of their principal residences. What had been intended as a monument of independence became an emblem of Medici triumph, absorbed into their legacy. This reversal captures in stone the fate of the Pitti family, a bold attempt to defy the Medici reduced to a chapter in the very narrative they had sought to resist. The palace, which should have been a lasting symbol of their greatness, became instead a symbol of how even the most ambitious opposition could be subsumed by the dynasty's enduring shadow. The obscurity of the Pitti today is not merely the result of their failure. It also reflects the way history is written by victors. The Medici, as with their treatment of the Strozzi, ensured that their rivals were remembered, if at all, as defeated challengers. Yet the truth is more complex. The Pitti family, at their height, were not marginal actors but central figures in the struggle to define Florence. Their palace still stands as testimony to their ambition, even if the narrative around it has been reshaped to glorify those who outlasted them. To recover their story is to restore the sense that Florence was a city of many possible futures, not just one dictated by Medici inevitability. The decline of the Pitti also illustrates what Florence lost when the Medici narrative became dominant. The city lost the memory of bold experiments in power, of families who dared to think they could balance or even surpass the Medici. The failure of the Pitti conspiracy is often told as proof of Medici superiority, but it could also be seen as evidence of how narrow the path of resistance had become. The Republic, once sustained by a diversity of powerful families and institutions, was being reduced to a stage where only one name mattered. In forgetting the Pitti, Florence forgets not only a family, but also the possibility of a city where grandeur and power were shared rather than monopolized. The story of the Pitti, when placed alongside the stories of the Albizzi and the Strozzi, reveals a consistent pattern in Florentine politics. Repeated efforts by rival families to resist Medici centralization, each effort bold in its own way, each ultimately unsuccessful. Yet their persistence demonstrates that Medici rule was never as absolute as later memory suggests. Each challenger kept alive the idea that Florence was more than a dynasty, that it was a republic where citizens and families still believed in alternative futures. The Pitti's failure is part of that larger tapestry of resistance, and their palace, looming over the southern side of the Arno, remains a silent reminder of what might have been. If we see the Palazzo Pitti today only as a Medici residence, we miss the defiance with which it was first conceived. We miss the ambition of Luca Pitti, who believed his family could rival the Medici not only in wealth but also in legacy. We miss the daring of those who plotted against Piero, imagining a Florence freed from Medici control. And we miss the tragedy of a family whose fortunes collapsed under the weight of failed conspiracy, leaving them remembered only in relation to their conquerors. By remembering the Pitti as more than defeated adversaries, we restore some of the richness of Florence's political life, a life that cannot be captured by the Medici shadow alone. The fall of the Pitti family left a gap in the long line of challengers who tested the strength of the Medici, but that gap was soon filled by another house whose ambitions and boldness nearly succeeded where others had failed. The Pazzi family had long-standing roots in Florentine life, their fortune built on the same combination of banking and commerce that sustained other great houses of the city. They were neither obscure nor minor. In fact, their network of connections and their financial reach extended well beyond Florence, giving them both the resources and the confidence to challenge Medici authority. Where the Strozzi had relied on patience and wealth, and the Pitti had relied on architectural display combined with conspiracy, the Pazzi turned to open violence, plotting one of the most dramatic assaults on Medici dominance in Florentine history. Their story culminates in the infamous conspiracy of the year 1478, a plot that, had it succeeded, might have shifted the entire course of the Republic's history. The resentment that fueled the Pazzi's conspiracy was rooted in the imbalance of influence in Florence. By the late 15th century, the Medici had entrenched themselves as the city's preeminent power, using their wealth not only to maintain political dominance, but also to monopolize prestige through cultural patronage. Families like the Pazzi, who had once stood as peers in the banking world, found themselves increasingly sidelined, their avenues to civic prominence narrowing as the Medici tightened their grip on key institutions. Resentment in Florence often brewed quietly in exile or in whispered alliances, but in the case of the Pazzi, it boiled over into outright violence. Their grievance was not only about honor and reputation, but also about survival in a political world where failing to challenge the Medici meant accepting permanent. The Pazzi conspiracy of 1478 was audacious in both scope and setting. Its central aim was to assassinate Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano, thereby removing the two leading figures of the family at a single stroke. To strike at both brothers simultaneously was not merely a tactical decision, but also a symbolic one. By destroying the heirs of Cosimo's line, the Pazzi and their allies hoped to decapitate Medici power in Florence, leaving a vacuum into which alternative leadership could step. The chosen moment for this assassination added to the drama and the horror of the plot. The conspirators struck during High Mass in the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, the heart of Florentine religious and civic life. To spill blood in such a sacred space was both a desperate gamble and a profound violation of the city's moral fabric. Yet for the conspirators, the risk was necessary. Only a public and decisive act could sever the grip of the Medici. The attack unfolded with shocking violence. Giuliano de' Medici was stabbed repeatedly and died on the spot, his young life cut short in an eruption of blades and chaos. Lorenzo, though wounded, managed to escape with his life, thanks in part to the quick intervention of friends and allies who shielded him from the conspirators' knives. This single twist of fate, the survival of Lorenzo, sealed the failure of the plot. In moments, what was supposed to be the destruction of Medici power turned into the destruction of the Pazzi themselves. The cathedral that had been chosen as the stage for Medici downfall instead became the scene of their triumph, as news of Lorenzo's survival spread rapidly and galvanized the city against the conspirators. The aftermath was brutal and immediate. Florence, bound by shock and anger, turned on the Pazzi with ferocity. Families in Florence had long known the dangers of failed conspiracies, but rarely had the punishment been so swift and so thorough. Members of the Pazzi family were hunted down, executed, and subjected to public humiliation. Jacopo de' Pazzi, one of the leaders of the conspiracy, was captured and hanged from a window of the Palazzo della Signoria, a grim reminder of the price of defiance. Others were dragged through the streets, their bodies mutilated as symbols of treachery. The violence was not confined to individuals. The Pazzi name itself was condemned. Their properties were confiscated, their coat of arms was erased from public view, and their memory was marked with dishonor. In a city where memory and reputation were everything, this erasure was perhaps the harshest punishment of all. The swiftness of the Medici reaction demonstrates not only their resilience, but also their mastery of symbolic power. By transforming the botched assassination into a narrative of survival and divine favor, Lorenzo reinforced the notion that the Medici were chosen to lead Florence. His personal survival, coupled with Giuliano's tragic death, became a story of sacrifice and providence, one that deepened loyalty among supporters and neutralized doubts about the family's legitimacy. The conspiracy, instead of breaking Medici dominance, consolidated it, allowing Lorenzo to emerge stronger than ever. He used the failed plot to rally allies across Florence and to portray his family as the bulwark against chaos and betrayal. The fall of the Pazzi family was absolute. Unlike the Strozzi, who remained in exile plotting possible returns, or the Pitti, whose palace endured as a symbol of their ambition, the Pazzi were eradicated from Florentine life almost entirely. Their name was stained beyond repair, their wealth scattered, and their descendants left with little hope of reclaiming former glory. Where once they had been pillars of the banking world, they became symbols of folly, remembered not for their achievements but for their failure. The swiftness of their destruction shows how little margin for error existed in Florence's political world once the Medici had consolidated power. The Pazzi conspiracy nearly succeeded, and its near success raises tantalizing questions about what might have happened had both Medici brothers fallen that day in the cathedral. Would Florence have reverted to a broader republican order, with multiple families sharing power? Would another dynasty, perhaps the Strozzi or even the remnants of the Albizzi, have filled the vacuum? Or would the city have descended into deeper chaos, prey to external powers eager to exploit its weakness? These questions remind us that Florence was not destined to follow the Medici path. Alternative futures were always possible, shaped by the actions of families like the Pazzi who dared to resist, even if their resistance failed. The erasure of the Pazzi from history is another example of what Florence lost when the Medici narrative became dominant. The conspiracy is remembered, but only as a story of Medici triumph. The Pazzi themselves are reduced to villains in a morality tale, their motives portrayed as envy and treachery rather than as expressions of deeper tensions within Florentine politics. Yet if we look past the Medici lens, we see a family that refused to accept subordination, a family that sought to reclaim space in a city increasingly closed to pluralism. Their choice of violence was extreme, but it reflected the extremity of the situation. By the late 15th century, the avenues for peaceful opposition had narrowed, leaving assassination as one of the few remaining options. The fact that they resorted to such a measure reveals just how tightly the Medici had constrained Florence's political possibilities. The legacy of the Pazzi conspiracy lingers not only in the ruined memory of the family, but also in the way it marked a turning point in the Republic's story. After 1478, opposition to the Medici became far more difficult. The brutality of the aftermath served as a warning to others. Failure would mean annihilation. While rivals still existed, they operated in an environment where the cost of resistance had grown immeasurably. This was perhaps the most lasting effect of the conspiracy, not the elimination of the Pazzi alone, but the chilling effect it cast over all who might have dreamed of challenging Medici control. To tell the story of Florence without the Pazzi is to miss one of the most dramatic episodes in its history. To tell it only through Medici eyes, however, is to miss the complexity of what was at stake. The Pazzi were not only conspirators, they were also bankers, citizens, and heirs to traditions of republicanism that stretched back generations. Their downfall was not simply the punishment of treachery, but the silencing of a voice in Florence's chorus of competing powers. By recovering their story, we recover the sense of a city alive with conflict, where even in failure, challengers like the Pazzi shaped the meaning of politics, power, and memory. The failed conspiracy of the Pazzi marked a decisive moment in Florence, not only because it confirmed the Medici's supremacy, but also because it revealed how deeply the city's destiny had been shaped by a multitude of families whose stories do not fit neatly into the triumphant narrative of a single dynasty. The Pazzi may have been destroyed, their names smeared and their memory condemned, but their dramatic rise and sudden fall remind us that Florence was always more than the Medici. If we look closely at the web of rivalries, alliances, ambitions, and failures, we see a city woven together by many hands, each pulling at the threads of art, commerce, politics, and memory. These unsung weavers of Florentine destiny contributed as much to the making of the city as those who claimed its glory, even when their contributions ended in defeat. The Albizzi, for instance, though overthrown by Cosimo de' Medici in the middle of the 15th century, had already set patterns of governance that would continue to shape Florence long after their fall. They had organized the city's councils, managed trade networks, and defended a vision of republican balance that became the framework within which the Medici themselves operated. Their displacement did not erase their influence. for Florence had been built on their leadership for generations. Even in defeat, the Albizzi left a model of civic order that could not be ignored. Similarly, the Strozzi, though pushed into exile, carried with them a republican vision of Florence that continued to haunt Medici rule. Their networks of trade and their intellectual patronage extended beyond the city, reminding Europe that Florence was a place of competing ideas, not simply the creation of one family. The Pitti, too, left their mark. Although their political conspiracy failed and their fortunes collapsed, their palace remained as a monumental statement of defiance, a stone record of ambition that could not be fully erased even when it was absorbed into Medici possession. The palace embodied the idea that Florence was a place where grandeur could emerge from rivalry, where families competed not only in politics, but also in the creation of lasting symbols. By building such an audacious residence, Luca Pitti inscribed his family's name into the fabric of the city, ensuring that even in obscurity, the Pitti could not be forgotten. And of course, the Pazzi, whose conspiracy is remembered chiefly for its failure, nevertheless reshaped Florence's political climate by demonstrating the peril of opposition. Their downfall served as a warning, but it also underscored the intensity of resentment that simmered beneath the surface of Medici dominance. Each of these families contributed not only to the political landscape, but also to the artistic and economic life of Florence. The Albizzi patronized artists and thinkers before the Medici had perfected their role as cultural patrons. The Strozzi funded churches, libraries, and commissions that enriched the city's spiritual and intellectual life. The Pitti invested in architecture that transformed the southern bank of the Arno, expanding the city's artistic geography. The Pazzi, even in their disgrace, left behind chapels and buildings that carried their name, spaces where art and devotion mingled. To focus solely on Medici patronage is to ignore this wider network of contributions, without which Florence could never have achieved the brilliance we now associate with the Renaissance. Economically, too, the unsung families played vital roles. Banking was never the monopoly of one house. The Medici may have managed the most famous bank, but the Pazzi, the Strozzi, and others ran networks that financed trade, funded voyages, and sustained the movement of goods and ideas. Their wealth helped knit Florence into the wider fabric of Europe, ensuring that the city was not an isolated jewel, but a vital hub in the international economy. Without the competition and collaboration of these families, the Medici Bank itself could not have flourished, for Florence's strength came from the density of its commercial life, not from the singular success of one line. The city's prosperity was always collective, even when one family claimed the lion's share of the credit. Politically, their defeats shaped Florence as much as their victories. Each exile, each conspiracy, and each downfall altered the balance of the Republic. The Albizzi's fall cleared the path for Cosimo, but also hardened the Medici resolve to avoid the mistakes of arrogance that had doomed their rivals. The Strozzi's persistence in exile kept alive the dream of Republican revival, inspiring later generations to imagine alternatives even when the Medici seemed secure. The Pitti's failed conspiracy against Piero revealed how fragile succession could be, reminding Florence that dynastic rule was never natural but always contested. The Pazzi's attempt to destroy Lorenzo and Giuliano through assassination not only failed, but also gave Lorenzo the opportunity to consolidate power, turning him into the Magnificent not only through his patronage, but through his survival. Each episode of rivalry shaped the Medici as much as it weakened their challengers, forcing them to adapt, refine their strategies, and deepen their hold on the city. The enduring legacy of these struggles lies not only in what the victors achieved, but also in what the defeated forced them to confront. The Medici were never unchallenged monarchs. They were families operating in a city alive with republican ideals and hostile rivals. Their success depended on their ability to outmaneuver, absorb, or suppress these challenges. To remember Florence as only a Medici creation is to forget that it was precisely the constant presence of opposition that gave Medici rule its distinctive character. Without the Albizzi, there would have been no Cosimo the Elder rising in defiance. Without the Strozzi, there would have been no exiles plotting returns, reminding Florence of the fragility of dynastic rule. Without the Pitti, there would have been no architectural arms race that left the city adorned with competing visions of grandeur. Without the Pazzi, there would have been no dramatic demonstration of Medici resilience in the face of mortal danger. Even in their defeats, these families shaped Florence as much as the Medici themselves. Their struggles created the texture of Florentine politics, where liberty and tyranny, republic, and dynasty constantly wrestled for supremacy. Their patronage broadened the artistic and cultural base of the Renaissance, ensuring that genius flourished in many corners of the city, not only in Medici-sponsored chapels and palaces. Their economic networks sustained the city's prosperity, making Florence more than a stage for Medici drama. And their downfall, tragic though it was, taught lessons about ambition, resilience, and the limits of power that continue to resonate in the way we understand. To rethink how we view Florence's history is to acknowledge this complexity. The Medici shadow is long, but it does not cover everything. The city we know today, the city visited for its art and architecture, admired for its republican traditions and studied for its political experiments, was the product of many families whose names have been pushed to the margins. To bring them back into the story is not to diminish the Medici, but to enrich our understanding of Florence itself. It is to see the Renaissance not as the gift of one dynasty, but as the outcome of a dynamic interplay of power, rivalry, creativity, and ambition. History often simplifies itself into singular narratives because they are easier to remember. The Medici provide a convenient thread, a family whose rise and endurance can be traced across centuries. But simplicity comes at a cost, erasing the messy, contested reality of a city that thrived on competition. By acknowledging the Albizzi, the Strozzi, the Pitti, the Pazzi, and others, we restore to Florence its full complexity. We see a city where power was never absolute, where grandeur emerged from rivalry, and where the memory of defeat was as important as the memory of triumph. The unsung weavers of Florentine destiny remind us that history is never the story of one family alone. It is the story of communities, of networks, of rivals and allies, of victories and failures intertwined. The Florence of the Renaissance was a tapestry woven by many hands, each thread essential to the pattern. To forget the weavers is to misunderstand the design. To remember them is to honor the city as it truly was. Not the possession of a dynasty, but the creation of a people whose struggles, ambitions, and rivalries gave it life.